In this video, we will examine the relationship between the beast that rises from the sea and the beast that rises from the land. Last video, we left off at verse 5. There was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Now, this word that is translated as blasphemy can actually also mean slander, which can be helpful here because it makes sense that one might blaspheme God because God is divine. But how do you blaspheme those who dwell in heaven if those are not divine beings as well? Well, it's more likely that they are simply being slandered. Remember the message to the church at Smyrna. I know your tribulation and your poverty and the slander of those who say they're Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. There was a synagogue at Smyrna who was accusing Christians of doing things that were politically subversive, and this seems to have resulted in the poverty of the church because government authorities came in and seized Christian property. So there is slander taking place here, something that the early church experienced in abundance. We know this not only because Nero slandered them and blamed them for the fire of Rome in 64, but in the 2nd century, during the time of Trajan, they were also being slandered, leading to the deaths of many. The text says that he blasphemes those who dwell in heaven, those who are God's tabernacle. Again, we want to remember that placement language in the book of Revelation is very spiritual. The idolaters are oftentimes referred to as those who dwell on the earth, but that's not because they're the only ones on the planet. It's because they have earthly identity, and therefore they're called those who dwell on the earth. There are many contexts where the church is discussed as being in heaven, even though the church is on the earth. You recall that the church leadership was referred to as angels at the beginning of the book. Angels are beings who exist in the heavenly realm. In chapter 11, the church was represented as 2 lampstands, and it was discussed as being in God's presence, and yet we've seen they were on the earth because they got martyred. The church has been described as being God's temple in this book, and according to Second Temple Judaism, the temple is the place where heaven and earth were connected. And so in this passage, when he slanders those who dwell in heaven, it's probably the Christians in the very next verse that he wages war on. He slanders them, and then he attacks them. So those who dwell on the earth is technical language for those who have an earthly identity. And those who dwell in heaven is oftentimes a technical language for the church because we have a heavenly identity. I challenge you, whenever you see this language about those who dwell in heaven in the book of Revelation, read the immediate context, and you will usually see that they in fact are living on the planet, but they are with Christ in heavenly places, as it says in Colossians chapter 3, and therefore they are discussed as though they are in heaven. Throughout this study, I have been refuting the popular view that the 3.5-year Great Tribulation is a literal future 3.5-year period. I have endeavored time and time again to show that the 3.5-year tribulation period in Daniel is taken in Revelation and used as a symbol for the entire church age, right? All Christian sufferers, all Christian martyrs, all those who have suffered financially for their faith, throughout the entire course of church history, they're all in view in this book. This book is not just about a final 7-year period or a final 3.5-year period. And so if you have been tracking along on this argument, now I want to summarize this argument because we've reached a place in the text where the 3.5 years is going to be mentioned for the last time. And so I want to provide a summary of all the reasons why the 3.5 years must be the entire church age and not just a period right before the second coming. In Daniel chapter 12, the prophetic destiny of all things was sealed up until the end time, which Daniel identified as 3.5 years. In Revelation 10, John is given the prophecy after it has been unsealed, suggesting John is already in the 3.5 years. Right? So if the prophetic destiny is sealed up, Daniel can't understand it. It's sealed up until the final 3.5 years. And then in Revelation, we saw it was unsealed and given to John. Well, that means John must live in the 3.5 years, which began way back in the 1st century at the beginning of the church age. We will see the same thing happen again in Revelation chapter 21. In Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9, John states that he is already in the tribulation. You will notice that the folks who think the tribulation is just a future 7-year period, they don't quote this verse that often because it would undermine their view. Daniel chapter 11 reveals the Great Tribulation is the same as the 3.5 years. We just said that. And in Revelation 7, we saw that the martyrs who came out of the Great Tribulation were the martyrs of the entire church age. And therefore, the 3.5 years is the entire church age. These martyrs were described as those who have washed their garments and made them white. Daniel 11 describes the 3.5-year Great Tribulation as a time for purification and being made white. In Revelation 11:2, the outer court of the temple was not measured and was given over to be trampled by the nations for 3.5 years, representing the physical vulnerability of the church. Christians have had physical vulnerability for the entire church age. This is not just something that's going to happen in some future period. This is a description of the Christian state of being in any century. In Revelation 11 and verse 3, the 2 lampstands, the church, witness for 3.5 years. Obviously, the church witnesses for the entire church age. The 2 different ways of describing the 3.5 years are clearly symbolic rectangular numbers. You will remember we discussed this back at the beginning of chapter 11. 42 months emphasizes the beast's activity because of 42's mathematical connection to 666. 1,260 days, another way of describing the 3.5 years, emphasizes the church's activities because of that number's connection to 49, the number of Jubilee. Now, if you did not see the video at the beginning of chapter 11, I recommend you go and see it because we explained the mathematics behind these numbers. Otherwise, what I'm saying here probably sounds like gibberish to you, and so I highly recommend going and watching that video. Very important for understanding the time frame in the book of Revelation. Daniel placed the 3.5 years at 1,290 days. That's 30 more days than in the book of Revelation, because he is thinking in terms of literal time, right? So 3.5 years on a Jewish lunar calendar is 42 months, and that's going to be 1,260 days, plus an additional 30 days for a leap month, because on the Jewish calendar, you add a leap month every 3 years. And so Daniel places it at 1,290 days. But John is thinking in symbolic time, so he subtracts the 30 days for leap month, making the 3.5 years an even 1,260 days. Right? There's no reason for John to include the leap month if he has taken 3.5 years as a symbol for the entire church age. He would only include Daniel's leap month if he's thinking in terms of a literal 3.5 years, but he's not. All right, and so he drops the leap month. In Revelation 12 and verse 6, the woman is spiritually nourished by God for 3.5 years. Now, of course, the church has been nourished by God for all of church history. In Revelation 12, Michael fights against Satan at the beginning of the church age to prevent him from accusing Christians in the heavenly court. According to Daniel 11, Michael fights for God's people at the time of the 3.5 years. Now that's a dead giveaway, because if according to the book of Daniel, Michael is going to fight for God's people at the time of the 3.5 years, and then you get to the book of Revelation, and he stands up and fights for God's people at the time of Jesus' resurrection and ascension, well, then that lets you know the 3.5 years have begun with the church age. In Revelation 12 and verse 6, the 3.5 years begins after Christ ascends to heaven, which would be the beginning of the church age. Now, this is the most obvious one to me. All right, you have a chronological timeline that is presented in Revelation 12 that began at the beginning of creation with Satan's rebellion at the beginning of creation, and it moves all the way up to the time of Christ. It narrates the events of Christ. Christ ascends to the Father, and then immediately the 3.5 years begin. That means the 3.5 years must be the church age. Those who see the 3.5 years as being some future period, they superimpose a 2,000-year gap in between Revelation 12 and verse 5 and verse 6. And there's just no justification for imposing that big of a gap in between those two verses. In Revelation 12, the dragon tries for 3.5 years to sweep the woman away with a flood of false teaching. The church has been targeted by false teaching for the entire church age. In Revelation 13, the beast blasphemes God, slanders and persecutes Christians, and rules over the masses of unbelievers. Political powers have been doing these things for the entire church age. So, those are my 13 reasons for suggesting the 3.5 years is a symbol for the entire church age. Revelation is a symbolic book. Everything in the context, these beasts, this dragon, this woman, the woman's seed, it's all symbols that point to something. It makes sense that the 3.5 years would be a symbol also. Now, if you're wearing your Superman underwear, you might dodge a few of these bullets. If you absolutely want the 3.5 years to be a literal future 3.5 year period, you might dodge a few of these bullets, but you're not going to dodge them all. Collectively, this is a formidable case. Every time John mentions the 3.5 years, he uses it in a way that is consistent with the entire church age. And in many places, that's all it can be. It can't be a future 3.5 year period. And so if you're used to thinking like that we're waiting for a 7-year tribulation, waiting for a final 3.5 year period, you need to recognize the book of Revelation is not chronologically landlocked in some future 7-year period, or some 3.5 year period. And it's also not locked up in the first century. This is a book that has prophetic application for the entire church age, past, present, and future. This is why it has so many things that happened in the first century. So much of the language in the book of Revelation refers to first century persons and institutions. And at the same time, the whole book was not fulfilled in the first century. Some of it is still waiting to be fulfilled at the second coming. That's because this book deals with the entire church age. It was also given to him to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. The beast conquers the church through national authority and military means. Violence is always the beast's primary method of harming the church. Now, there is an interesting irony that takes place here, because John is well aware that only about 10 verses ago, he told us that when the beast kills us, we have actually conquered him. And they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life, even when faced with death. And now here we are at a place where when the beast kills us, he has conquered us. And so there's an irony here. There are two types of conquering that take place when the beast kills us. From a worldly and temporary perspective, he has killed us because he has taken our lives. But from an eternal and heavenly perspective, we have conquered him because we have gone on to reign with Christ in eternity. You recall that in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and in Colossians chapter 2, whenever Christ allowed the powers of darkness to kill him, he defeated them. And so whenever we are murdered with Christ, it is so that we can reign with Christ. We have conquered the kingdom of darkness with Christ through sharing in his sufferings. And notice also that this is in contrast to the invincibility of the woman in the last chapter. You recall that the woman represents the people of God in their spiritual safety and in their spiritual purity. And the woman was untouchable. It didn't matter what the dragon did to her. He could never harm her. And this is because nobody can pluck us out of the Father's hand. We are eternally secure. The church can never be so corrupted as to vanish from the earth. We are spiritually invincible. But now this chapter wants to focus on our physical vulnerability as people who belong to Christ. We are vulnerable to the violence of people who hate the church. And so in this chapter, we're not nearly as invincible as we were in the last chapter. In this chapter, we are very vulnerable to violence. And so the beast is given the authority to harm us, to take us captive, and potentially to take our lives. Now, verse 8 brings us to a verse that is very theologically controversial. And it's because the Greek paragraph can be translated in two different ways. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. And it could also be translated, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain from the foundation of the world. So in the first translation, your names are written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world. And in the second translation, the Lamb has been slain from the foundation of the world. Now, both of these translations come with their own theological baggage. If the first one is true, if our names have been written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world, then this raises the basic problems that Calvinists and predetermination people oftentimes have when they advance their theology. Did God decide when time began who would and who would not be saved? Is free will an illusion that is trumped by God's sovereign decision back before the creation ever began? It's this idea, if God selected before the world began who would be saved, then does that mean he, by implication, chose all the other people who would not be saved? I mean, are some people predestined when they're born to be saved and other people are predestined to damnation because they were not written in the book? That is one of the big problems that is raised when you go with this first translation and with that kind of theology. If you go with the other translation, you still have issues. If God chose to have Christ crucified from the beginning of the world, does that mean God willed the fall to happen, along with sin, suffering, and death, so that he could later redeem us from our divinely predetermined condition? Right? So this suggests that, or at least some people will read it and say that it suggests that God always willed for the fall to take place. And so the reason Christ is slain from the foundation of the world is because before this ever began, God intended for the fall to happen, and therefore he intended to redeem us from the fall with Jesus. And then that raises a serious theodicy question. Why would God predetermine sin, suffering, and death to be part of the human experience? So both of these are very challenging. Now, some folks are going to say that whether you go with the first or the second translation, that if you make it a matter of God's foreknowledge, then you can wiggle yourself out of either one of these problems. So God has written our names in the book from the foundation of the world, not because he has pre-selected and predetermined some people to come into the Christian faith, but because he knew before the world ever began who would do it. Right? He didn't choose some to come into salvation and some to come into damnation. He just knew who would, and so he wrote the names in advance based on foreknowledge. And the same thing with the other translation. They'll say that God did not will the fall, he just allowed it to happen. But he always knew it would happen, and so he had predetermined within himself to have Christ crucified as part of our redemption. So I'm just going to echo what most Revelation scholars will say at this verse. John probably isn't trying to have a big theological discussion on the sovereignty of God versus the free choice of people. He's probably not thinking about predetermination. He's probably not thinking about foreknowledge, at least in such detail that he wants to resolve this age-long theological dispute. I personally think that the translation on the right side is more likely. And a lot of Greek scholars say that because even though both of these translations are possible in Greek, the one on the left, that our names have been written from the foundation of the world, that requires taking the Greek word order and seriously rearranging it. Now, you can do that in Greek. Word order is much more flexible. But if you just leave the word order alone and let it read it in a natural and straightforward way, the word order looks more like this other translation. The Lamb has been slain from the foundation of the world. And so in my personal opinion, God knew the fall would take place. He took considerable risk. He allowed that to happen. And he always knew that he would send his son to die for the sins of the world. I don't think that God has pre-selected some for salvation and some for damnation. John is probably not wanting to have a big theological debate about predetermination, but there is something he is always wanting to talk about, and that is getting Christians to accept their physical vulnerability as God's people. Now, in this passage, the beast was just given authority to harm the people of God, and this naturally raises the question, when the beast comes for me, should I fight? Is it okay for me to arm myself and fight to prevent my captivity or to prevent the beast from taking my life? Well, look what John says. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. Now, this is an extremely difficult challenge to issue to the church, for them to accept their captivity and to accept their deaths without fighting back. And John knows that this is a difficult teaching. This is why he buffers it. Before he says it, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. Because you have to have spiritual ears to hear this. A physical person, a person who is merely a human being, a person with physical ears, is not going to accept this. All right, this is a very unnatural thing to do, to accept your captivity or to accept your death. He says this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Indeed, you're going to have to be a saint. You're actually going to have to be faithful. And you're going to have patient endurance in order to accept suffering, to accept captivity, to accept death. This is the great challenge of the book of Revelation, to accept your death and conquer through death so that you can reign with Christ. Nowhere in this book is the church ever depicted as taking up arms and engaging in some sort of a malicious squabble with the beast. I want to give you a couple of perspectives from a few different Revelation scholars on this passage. Grant Osborne says, here we see God's instruction for the proper Christian response to their persecutors, pacifism. This does not mean that we sit idly by and allow evil to triumph. Rather, we take a prophetic stance and warn evildoers of the folly of their actions, but we do so as part of our gospel proclamation, not as part of a revolutionary plot to overthrow. When one is put to the sword as a result of that bold proclamation, it is endurance and faith that gives one the courage to face martyrdom. I remember back when Barack Obama became president, there were a lot of people who thought he was going to be the Antichrist. And they even began to form militias for fighting the beast, militias for fighting the Antichrist. One guy who thought Barack Obama was the Antichrist fired a bullet at the White House. And of course, they apprehended him, and the bullet did no harm. And he fired it from an overpass a good distance away from the White House. But this is interesting because according to this book, when the beast comes for you, you don't fight. This is the difficulty of being like Jesus. You don't guard your life by trying to become deadly and kill your enemies. So even if the beast comes, the instruction of the book is not to grab a gun and start shooting. Violence is the method of the beast. It is not the method of God's people. Another perspective from G.K. Bill. The exhortation, if anyone has an ear, let him hear, was used repeatedly in the letters to the 7 churches to encourage the readers not to compromise and to bear up under the consequences of suffering for their faith. With such discernment, they should be strengthened to endure their destiny of captivity, imprisonment, or even death by the sword. Their spiritual insight should motivate them to suffer according to the will of God and to entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Christians are to obey the state because it was ordained by God. But when the state oversteps its bounds and demands religious worship of itself, then Christians are not to submit, but they are to submit to the punishments that the state decrees for this non-compliance. We do not submit to the call to commit an act of idolatry or an act of evil. As Christians, we do not obey the state in that, but we are going to submit when the beast comes to harm us. That is what this text is telling us to do. Revelation's statement that we are to accept our captivity and we are to accept our deaths at the hands of the beast comes from an Old Testament passage. And as so often when the book of Revelation quotes the Old Testament, there are certain aspects of the Old Testament context that are being brought over into the book of Revelation, and there are other aspects that are being left behind. Now, this passage in Jeremiah is a passage where the king of Babylon is coming to destroy Jerusalem. And the people of Israel are being told to submit to the punishments that he is bringing on the people. And it shall be that when they say to you, where should we go? Then you are to tell them, thus says the Lord, those destined for death, to death, and those destined for the sword, to the sword, and those destined for famine, to famine, and those destined for captivity, to captivity. Now, the obvious element that is being carried over is that you are to submit to these things, that you are to not fight against these inevitable punishments that the state is bringing upon you. But what is different is the reason for these sufferings. In the Old Testament context, the people were disobedient to Yahweh, and because they were disobedient, he was bringing the Babylonians to punish them. Now, this is the opposite of what we have in the book of Revelation. In Revelation, we are suffering not because of our disobedience, but because of our allegiance to Yahweh. As we're suffering at the hand of the state was a sign of disobedience in the book of Jeremiah, in Revelation, it is very specifically a sign of our obedience. We are suffering with Christ because we share in his commitment to the gospel. Throughout the book of Revelation, the writer has been summoning us to embrace our vulnerability, that even when we have violent opponents, that we are to respond to them with nonviolence. Now, I haven't taken much time to connect this to other teachings in the New Testament. But I want to do that now because I'm afraid that some people will look at this message in Revelation 13 that we are to submit to the punishments of the beast without fighting him back. And they're going to say that Revelation is just a strange book that has some weird teachings. But actually, what Revelation is teaching is just the natural extension of other things that have already been taught in the New Testament. Take, for example, this sermon of Jesus. To one who strikes you on one side of the jaw, offer the other side also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Now, when this verse is usually reproduced, you will hear people say if someone smites you on one side of the cheek, and they try to soften this to be kind of this dainty picture of somebody slapping you. But the word in Greek is not cheek. The word is jaw. Right? This is a brawny and violent image here. If someone strikes you on one side of the jaw, you show him the other side of your jaw. A very counterintuitive thing to do, a very unnatural thing to do that Jesus expects of his followers. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Now these animal metaphors are very easy to understand. Innocent as doves, wise as serpent. And obviously, to be like sheep among wolves is to be vulnerable. Vulnerable as sheep are among wolves. Now, if you're wondering what this looks like, I'm sure you can Google it or you can YouTube it. To be sheep among wolves is a very dangerous situation. It is a picture of ultimate vulnerability. And notice here that Jesus is summoning his disciples to be like this, to accept their physical vulnerability, to embrace their physical vulnerability, as he does when he embraces the cross. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. The context of this is interesting. Jesus is telling his disciples how they are to respond to living under the dominion of enemy soldiers. Because in the ancient Roman context, the Jews were a subjugated people. And if a Roman soldier told a Jew to drop what he was doing and to help him carry his bag for a mile, he could do this. Legally, any Roman soldier could have a subjugated person carry his load for a mile. And notice what Jesus is saying to do. He's saying to carry it for 2 miles. It's very difficult for us in our context to understand what a radical and controversial teaching this would be. The Romans were murderers. The Romans were extortioners. The Romans were worshippers of false gods. Sometimes, when they carried out acts of violence against the Jewish people, they didn't spare the old and they didn't spare the young. Sometimes the Romans were rapists. I mean, they were a terror in the land of Israel. And sometimes they went out of their way to interfere with the worship of the biblical God, as when the Emperor Caligula attempted to set up an image of himself in the temple, or as when Pontius Pilate did set up an image of the Roman eagle at the entrance to the temple. I mean, these are bad guys. To try to understand this would be like if ISIS conquered and took over, and you looked out your window and you seen a Christian out there doing extra chores in service to ISIS. That's what Jesus is telling Jews to do within the ancient context of the first century while living under Roman dominion. And obviously here you can see that those who would say, no, 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 Jesus, we have a precedent for this in Scripture. God raised up Samson. God raised up Joshua. God raised up Delilah. And so now we need to rise up and we need to get rid of these killers, these rapists, these worshippers of false gods. Notice Jesus is not complicitous with that mentality. Much to the contrary. You love your enemies, and even if the enemies of the state, even if the enemies of the Jewish people come in and conquer you, if they ask you to carry a load for a mile, you carry it too. This is an incredible thing that Jesus expects his followers to do in relationship to their national enemies. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. N.T. Wright says that Jesus' instructions at this point are quite specific. His followers are not to imagine, out of false national loyalty, that they had a duty to stay in Jerusalem and go down with the ship. If China invaded the United States, what is my job as a Christian? Am I to run and help defend the border? Should I participate in the battle to rescue Washington, D.C.? Or as a Christian, is it my job to be about the Father's business, to be tending to the things of the gospel and to the things of the kingdom of God? Well, I would certainly think that if these Jews who were proud and who had a deep heritage and had a lot of national allegiance, if Jesus doesn't expect them to stay and fight to defend their country, if they are to move on and deal with the things of the kingdom of God, then the same is true as us Christians. All right, the nations have been fighting long before we were born. The nations will be fighting long after we are dead. We are only alive for a little bit of time, and you cannot squander this time fighting for the nations of the world, these transit nations that are here today and gone tomorrow. With the little bit of time you have in this life, you don't need to be caught up with that. You need to be tending to the things of God's kingdom, the only nation, the only kingdom that will exist forever. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will perish by the sword. Now, this verse is an excellent verse for highlighting the differences between the way ancient Christians read the New Testament and the way modern Christians read the New Testament. In the ancient church, there was a saying that when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every soldier. Christians took this verse very seriously. They thought Jesus meant what he said, and now Christians are not permitted to engage in deadly combat under any circumstances. If he disarmed Peter, he disarmed every soldier. Now, in our modern context, people do not even come anywhere close to this type of ancient interpretation. In fact, in the ancient context, if you joined the church and then you joined the army, they would kick you out of the church. Because how were you going to obey the Sermon on the Mount if you had a military career? You're, almost invariably, you would be placed in some sort of a violent situation. or at least you signed up and made yourself susceptible to being placed in a violent situation. And Christians do not practice violence. We practice the Sermon on the Mount. And so ancient Christians, they understood the teachings of Jesus this way for the first few centuries. But in our context, when I have mentioned this verse to people and told them how ancient Christians read this verse, well, this type of reading is not even considerable. A reading of the teachings of Jesus that might somehow interfere with your national duty or your national commitments or the homage you pay to the military, etc. Nobody would, in our context, would dare allow any of the teachings of Jesus interfere with our national allegiances. We've come a long way since the early church, and I can't say in the right direction. Some people in our context think that what Jesus is doing here is he's essentially becoming the safety coordinator for OSHA, that he's simply warning you of vocational hazards, like if you become a pilot, you might end up wrecking your plane. Or if you become an electrician, you might end up getting shocked. Well, if you draw the sword, well, you might end up getting slain by the sword. It's as though the Messiah all at once decided that he's going to withdraw from the world of moral teaching. He's going to withdraw from the world of spiritual teaching. And he's just going to give a few safety disclaimers about the dangers of drawing a sword. He's not necessarily saying it's good or bad to draw a sword. He's just letting you know that it's potentially physically dangerous to do so. But at what point in Jesus' ministry did he ever stop teaching about the kingdom of God? Did he ever stop teaching about spirituality and morality and just start giving, these sort of neutral health hazard warnings? All right, I think that is a ridiculous interpretation, and it's a way to avoid what Jesus is plainly teaching. Another way that people interpret this is that Jesus isn't actually saying anything about combat, whether it be personal or national combat. He's saying, look, Peter, I need to die to pay for the sins of the world. And if you fight off these guys who are coming to arrest me, then how am I supposed to pay for the sins of the world? And the implication of that is that if the atonement of sins was not on the line, then Peter could draw the sword and defend himself with deadly force. He just can't do so tonight because the Messiah is supposed to die for the sins of the world. Now, I could go with that, but the problem is Jesus doesn't say, Peter, put your sword back in its place, for the Messiah must die for the sins of the world. Instead, he says something much more general. Put it back in its place, for all who draw the sword will perish by the sword. Now, that is a very general statement. All who draw the sword will perish by the sword. That is not the sort of thing that suggests that this teaching is very particular to the night of Jesus' betrayal, or that this teaching is only in effect on that night because Jesus needs to go die and pay for sins. This is a very general statement about all who draw the sword. And so the only real question here is, what does he mean? Does he mean all who draw the sword will perish by the sword physically? I mean, that wouldn't seem to make sense. Everyone who literally draws a sword does not die in combat. In towns all over the United States, you can find people who have fought in Afghanistan and fought in Iraq, and they did not die. There are all sorts of people who participated in personal level violence, and they have not died. So the other option to me seems to be that all who draw the sword will perish by the sword spiritually. That is, Jesus is warning his followers, if you reject his teachings to embrace your vulnerability, if you reject his teachings of nonviolence and you choose to participate in violence, then there is a spiritual consequence. There is potentially an eternal consequence for thwarting the teachings of Jesus and embracing the violence that has characterized the normalcy of human civilization as long as it has existed. Speaking of weapons, Paul says, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now, there are three military metaphors here: weapons, strongholds, and taking captive. And Paul is making it clear that as Christians, we do not do these things in the way the world does. That is, in a combative context. Rather, we are engaged in a different type of warfare, and our type of warfare holds nothing in common with the warfare of the world. Some people might say, yes, but there is so much war in the Old Testament. If the New Testament is changing this, if it is putting a new standard in place, well, then where is the New Testament passage that just openly criticizes war in general? James 4, verses 1 through 2. What causes wars and what causes fightings among you? Is it not your passions that are at war in your members? You desire and do not have, so you kill. And you covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and wage war. Uh, it's not like it was when Joshua went in to conquer the land of Canaan. God has been more perfectly revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, and so that means a lot of these things that were acceptable in the Old Testament period have to be reevaluated in light of what Jesus has done, in light of the way that Jesus has lived, in the way that Jesus has died, in the way that Jesus has taught his disciples. Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now, I submit to you that we just have to accept this, right? There is always going to be violence. There's always going to be violence in the culture. There's always going to be violence in the household. There's always going to be violence among the nations. As Christians, it is our job to do what Jesus has done here, to respond by being a healing presence. Right? We cannot stop the wars of the world. They are going to take place. But when they do, as Christians, it's our job to try to shoulder the burden of the victims, to be a healing presence, to help people in whatever way we can whose lives have been transformed by violence. But in no sense are we as Christians ever supposed to pick up the sword and go and participate in the wars of the world. There is just no evidence in the New Testament that we are able to do that, and there is plenty of evidence that that would be an act of disobedience, that that would be to neglect the teachings of the gospel. Then I saw another beast which rose out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It works great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of men. And by the signs which it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, bidding them to make an image for the beast which had the plague of the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast should even speak, and to cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Its number is 666. The Lamb that spoke like a dragon. We need to recognize that there is a parody of the Trinity taking place here. Just as we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, so in the book of Revelation, you have the dragon, and then you have the beast from the sea and the beast from the land. All right? And it's not just that, you have three persons of the Trinity, and now you have this false Trinity leading a rebellion against God. The relationship between the members of the evil Trinity is also a counterfeit of the relationship between the persons of the true Trinity. As Christ received authority from the Father, so the sea beast receives authority from the dragon. And as the Holy Spirit glorifies Christ, so the land beast glorifies the sea beast. Right? The Holy Spirit doesn't just testify of himself. The Holy Spirit is always pointing us to Jesus. And that's what this second beast is doing. He's not about himself. The second beast, that is this beast from the land, he is always pointing people to the beast that is from the sea. And just as Jesus says he has no power of his own, but he has received it from the Father, so this sea beast, he has received authority from his father, the dragon. So counterfeit is what Satan does all the way throughout this book, and you can see it's full blown in this text. The two horns are to mimic the two witnesses, the two lampstands, and the two olive trees back in chapter 11. Those were symbols that spoke to the role of the church and the mission and its mission to direct people to worship Jesus, the Lamb who was slain and resurrected. So the church's job is to witness unto Jesus who is dead and raised from the grave. And it's the job of this false lamb with these two horns to witness to the dragon, to the beast that rose from the sea, who had the deadly wound and then had a false resurrection. So who is the lamb who causes the earth dwellers to worship the first beast? I mean, the original Christians in Asia Minor who received the book of Revelation, when they look out their window, who would they look at and say, yeah, that's who this is? That's who the beast is. Well, there are two options here. One is the emperor cult. Now, the emperor cult was those temples and priesthoods spread throughout the empire whose job it was to secure the loyalty of the citizens to the empire by having them worship the emperor as though he was a god. And while the emperor worship was taking place in various degrees throughout the empire, based on which province you're in, not every emperor actually liked the emperor cult. While Augustus and Tiberius forbade emperor worship, Caligula encouraged it, replacing heads on many statues with his own, and even trying to set up a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. After him, only Domitian likewise encouraged such worship. So Domitian is the emperor at the time Revelation is written. It's the result of him ramping up the emperor cult. He really liked this idea of being worshipped like a god, which created so many problems in Asia Minor. Of all the provinces in the empire, the emperor cult was taken the most seriously where our seven churches are, where John was, in the area around Ephesus, in the area of Asia Minor. And so when you get this emperor who really wants people to worship him, the province of Asia Minor is going to take this very seriously, because the eastern part of the empire comes from ethnicities and cultures that had a long tradition of the God King. And so people around the city of Rome, they may not take it very seriously that the emperor is actually divine, but people in the eastern part of the empire, they would be inclined to take it much more seriously. And so since it was the job of the emperor cult to facilitate the worship of the state or the head of state, this may be who is referred to by the land beast who causes people to worship the beast from the sea. Another option for the beast who looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon is that he represents a form of false Christianity. That this beast looks like a lamb would surely remind the original seven churches of Jesus' rebuke of false teachers like Jezebel and the Nicolaitans, which encourage compromise with the culture's idolatrous institutions, which are all associated in some way with the Roman cult. You will remember back in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, you had teachers like Jezebel at Thyatira, who were guilty of teaching a type of compromise that involved fornication and eating food sacrificed to idols. And what most Revelation scholars think is that this is a reference to the trade guilds. In order to be anyone of significance in the ancient economy, you had to be the member of a trade guild. And this is very tricky for Christians, because in order to be in the trade guild, you had to pay homage to the god who was the patron god of that particular guild. You had to pay homage to the emperor as though he were divine. And female prostitutes are brought in to service the men at the end of the business transactions. And so obviously a Christian cannot participate in this if he intends to be faithful. But that means that he can't be anybody in the economy either. He has to suffer a massive financial loss, and about the only way he could make his way in the world is by being a day laborer. And so, since we have a lamb here that speaks like a dragon, that would seem to be a reference to these false Christian teachers. And we'll see these guys referenced again at the end of the chapter, those who will compromise with idolatry for the sake of making money or participating in the economy. Also, uh, this beast brings down fire from heaven. Now, that is a parody of the prophet Elijah. And we saw in Revelation chapter 11 that Elijah is a symbol for the church in this book. And so that this beast is a false Elijah would suggest that this is a false form of the church, a compromised version of Christianity. And by the signs which it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, bidding them to make an image for the beast which had the plague of the sword and yet lived. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. We talked a lot in the last lesson about how the beast has a head that received a mortal wound. The heads represent kings, and then when the beast revived, this may all draw on the Nero redivivus myth. This notion that Nero died, but he is coming back with consequences. That there is surely some of that in the imagery. However, there is much more theological stuff taking place here than just a reference to Nero. The plague of the sword refers to the sword of divine judgment that issues from Christ's mouth. We see this in a number of places in the book. The sword is coming out of his mouth. And plague is reminiscent of God's judgments throughout the book. So just as Jesus spoke the world into existence, now these plagues are acts of decreation, and he is speaking these plagues in existence against the empire that is persecuting the church. Notice also that it is against the head of the beast. Now, this is an echo of this passage in Genesis chapter 3, where God is addressing the serpent, and he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, this is very interesting, because the serpent receives his wound on the head. Well, his offspring, this beast, is carrying around the same wound as his father. And since the beast represents a political presence, well, how could this work out? Satan was decisively defeated by the woman's seed at the cross. He now tries to hide his death with a fake resurrection by using the nations to destroy the church. Right? This is his false resurrection. Satan, and therefore the beast, was decisively defeated by the seed of the woman at the cross. All right? And we learn from Daniel chapter 7 that all the political nations of the world, they were defeated at the time of the cross and when the Messiah approaches the Ancient of Days to receive authority. That is when it's stated that the beast will be allowed to exist a little bit longer, but the judgment has already been cast against them. The nations of the world will all perish because Christ triumphed at the cross. And so Satan was defeated there. And so was the beast who is made in his image. And so the beast is carrying around this defeat, this political entity that shows up at various points and in various forms in history to persecute the church. It is defeated along with its satanic father. But it has a fake resurrection. Again, parodying Christ. It tries to hide its death by exerting military and violent force against the church. But that is a fake resurrection. That is just the way that the beast and the dragon try to hide the fact that the woman's seed has already defeated them at the cross. It says that if they didn't worship this image, that they were to be put to death. Now, Revelation scholars will tell you again and again that this is an echo of this episode back in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. Now notice the prominence of the number 6. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. So would this make any sense to the original Christians who received this book from John? Well, it would, because Domitian set a statue of himself up in Ephesus, which was the home to the first of our 7 churches, and demanded that it be worshipped. Worship of the colossal 16-foot statue was required by the whole province and not just Ephesus alone, which means that all 7 of the churches would have been affected. And you can see a picture at the top here of the archaeological remains of Domitian's temple, and at the right you can see the remains of the statue that caused so much problems for the Christians in John's day. Now, this historical episode would have exerted serious pressure and persecution on Christians to conform, and would have easily reminded them of the Daniel 3 story. Citizens of towns in Asia Minor were even pressured to offer sacrifices on altars outside their own houses as festive processions passed by. The entire province was required to participate in the rites, and the cities held parallel worship in their own temples, requiring that all citizens participate. All right, so it's a scheduled event. Different towns are all required to gather in their imperial temples and worship the Caesar at the same time. Well, you have some families missing. Well, who are they? Well, they're Christians. Well, we have another family missing. They're Christian. And it's, the pattern is going to become clear that Christians are not participating. And this was the claim against the early church, that we were haters of humanity. When Christians were put on trial, that was usually the charge, that we were haters of humanity because we wouldn't go to the violence of the games, because we wouldn't participate in all these aspects of national life which had idolatry mixed in. Christians were thought to be haters of humanity, and this is nothing new in our time. We're accused of being intolerant, we're accused of being hateful, etc., because we won't do the things that the world does. They will always play this card against us. But they have been doing this as long as there has been a church. He breathed into the image so that it could speak. Now, there are 2 basic possibilities here. The first one is that spiritual darkness is actually participating in pagan rituals and communicating with people, and that this is all very real, that maybe the dark spirits associated with paganism are actually working signs and wonders. In the Roman world, the popular view was that the gods inhabited the statues that represented them. Statues in ancient writings are variously described as turning, sweating, weeping, and speaking. This passage may be acknowledging that the idols have power, but not divine power, since the gods do not exist, but rather demonic power, since fallen angels stand behind the idols. It is also possible that this is a reference to answered prayers, visions, dreams, protection, healing, etc., as they occurred within idolatrous religion. There was a group of magicians called Thurgis, who would place magical materials, usually stones or herbs or scents, in the cavity of a statue in order to induce it to talk. And this would lead to oracular speech by the priest or the casting of lots that people believed the god was directing. Right? And so, you have an oracle go up there and she puts her ear up against the mouth of the statue and she turns and gives a message, or there's some other type of a lot casting, some sort of ritualized way of getting a message from the idol. Potentially the powers of darkness could participate in these rituals and could deceive people into worshiping the state or into worshiping the emperor. The other possibility is that there is deception taking here, that is religious, and it's religious fraud. And religious fraud was not unknown in the ancient world. The ancient writer Lucian describes a charlatan named Alexander who constructed a serpentine image of Asclepius with a movable mouth and concealed speaking tubes for giving oracles. So we're thinking like the Wizard of Oz. There's somebody hiding behind the curtain, trying to deceive people into thinking more is taking place here than what is actually taking place. Hippolytus reports a talking skull, which was rigged up by combining a human skull with a windpipe of a crane as a speaking tube. Historians have suggested that special effects equipment were used to produce speaking and moving statues, as well as a simulated thunder and lightning in the imperial temple. So people, rigging stuff up inside the statues so that they could speak through these tubes and actually deliver a message. And I don't know what they used, to try to make people think that there was a sound of thunder or lightning, but the ancient theater, there were all sorts of sounds and things simulated where they just take some of these things out of the theater and employ them in the idol's temple, and they can deceive all sorts of people. And so whether you have dark forces actually participating in pagan rites, or whether you have this type of religious fraud, there were all sorts of things that the original Christians could look at in their world and say, yeah, I understand what John is talking about. This is what he's talking about. And however this prophecy is fulfilled in the present or in the future, it builds on the original meaning. Each additional fulfillment of a prophetic text must build on the original fulfillment. And within the original context of the first century of the seven churches in Asia Minor, there are all sorts of ways that this could be understood, that the image of the beast was speaking. So now this takes us to the mark of the beast, which is a substantive conversation. Sorry, I've been teaching all day long, and I'm losing my voice and losing my speech capacity, so it's probably a good thing this is coming to an end. But next week, we will have a discussion on the mark of the beast, and I suspect that'll be very interesting, and so hopefully you will join me for that.